Okay, greetings everyone. Welcome back to our second to last meeting of our Human De-Evolution reading group. Today, we are going to hear a summary of chapters 9 and 10, Paranormal Modification and Production of Biological Form, and chapter 10, about fine-tuning a universe designed for life. And I was just looking at just how many chapters we have left, and we got through this very hefty book. I wouldn't have been able to do it without you guiding us, so we're very grateful. Okay, thank you very much for joining us, and you can go ahead.
Okay, I'll share a screen. Is it coming up?
Yes, we can see your PowerPoint.
Okay, we'll go to full screen. Okay. So thank you all for coming to hear this penultimate talk in this lecture series, reading through Human Devolution, a Vedic alternative to Darwin's theory. And I've been discussing what the text is about, what its impact at the time the book was published was, and what its current relevance may be. So thank you all. So thus far, just to review, the book begins by stating the problem as it was expressed at the time Darwin published his book, Origin of Species, namely, are we fallen angels or ascended apes? In other words, are we purely material beings, or is there perhaps some non-material aspect to our reality? Of course, that would pose an alternative to the now dominant theories. So in the next few chapters of the book, I established the need for an alternative by looking at the shortcomings in the fossil evidence and the genetic evidence. And then next, I began to present a non-material alternative. But since I'm basically addressing a Western and Western science influenced audience, I wanted to show that the need for an alternative had been noticed within that circle itself. It gave the example of Alfred Russel Wallace, co-founder of the theory of evolution by natural selection with Darwin, who introduced some non-material perspectives on the question of the origin of the human species. And he basically proposed that there's more to a human being than just ordinary matter. There's mind and consciousness. So in the next chapters of the book, I gave modern scientific evidence consistent with the idea that we're a combination of gross physical elements, subtle material, mental, and intellectual elements, and consciousness itself. And that led to the idea that the cosmos is divided into these different levels, each dominated by energies of gross physical matter, subtle material elements, and a level of pure consciousness. And each of these levels is inhabited by beings adapted to the conditions there. And now, today, we're going to look at evidence that shows that beings at the higher levels of this hierarchy of beings are able to influence the modification and production of biological forms on the different levels. So today we're going to be dealing with Chapter 9, which is on the paranormal modification and production of biological form, and Chapter 10, a universe designed for life. So the basic idea that we demonstrated in the last couple of chapters was that we exist in a multi-level universe with levels of ordinary matter, subtle material, mental, and intellectual energies, and then a level of pure consciousness or spirit with beings adapted to the different conditions there. And although all life forms are emanating from a common source, uh, we actually observe around us a vast variety of species, including our own species. So how did these species come about? Ultimately, we want to suggest, we have to keep in mind where we're going, that higher beings are involved in the productions of our bodies, which are vehicles for conscious selves. And if we look at the Vedic cosmology, we see there are beings called Prajapatis and others that are responsible for the production of the biological forms that we occupy, in our case, the human species. So we have to look at how Darwin tried to develop an argument for his idea. Uh, Basically, he proposed that if we look at the world that's visible to us today, we can see that people like farmers, they and other people, they breed plants and animals. He was especially interested in pigeons. He noticed how that people can, by selecting which pigeons to mate, can introduce new forms of pigeons. And this is also true of dogs, cattle, cows, many other life forms as well. People in the world today, visibly around us, are able to induce changes by artificial selection. Now, what Darwin proposed was, just imagine that this process went on over vast periods of time with nature rather than human beings, farmers and agriculturalists, with nature rather than human beings doing the selection and selective breeding. So uh, that was his basic method. He pointed to something we could observe, namely that we can breed animals and induce small changes in them, which accumulate generation by generation. Now, the pigeons remain pigeons, the dogs that are bred remain dogs, but he proposed that if this process extended far enough, with nature doing the selecting, eventually you would get new species. Now, I will point out that up to the present day, the origin of the different body plans for various types of bodily vehicles for conscious selves to occupy has not been solved. Uh, these quotes here from this recent scientific literature make this point. Foremost among the unresolved problems confronting modern biology is the origin of biological complexity, most notably that of the shape and form of our own bodies. So remains an unsolved problem. But what I was proposing in this chapter of human devolution is that on our part, we can make use of the same principle that Darwin was using, namely, since we're interested in showing some higher influence from some type of cosmic intelligent beings that influence the body shapes and forms that we see around us, including our own, we can point to examples, observable examples of how people on this planet are able to induce changes in biological form by what we might call conscious intention or paranormal influence. And then we can propose, as Darwin did, well, just imagine if human beings on our level, using their intelligence and consciousness and intention, can induce changes of this nature, what could higher beings with greater intelligence and powers be able to do in terms of the production and modification of biological form? So in this chapter of human devolution, I began with examples of influence on microorganisms done in laboratory experiments, for example, by Beverly Rubik of the Institute for Frontier Sciences at Temple University in Philadelphia during the 1990s. She did a study involving a medium and named Olga Warhol, and she was able, by her healing intention, able to induce changes in microorganisms. There's a quote there explaining how she influenced bacterial cultures to increase their rate of growth, compared to a control culture of bacteria. In all cases, there was a significant increase in growth of the bacteria in the cultures treated by Warhol. And her only treatment was to, in her understanding, emanate energy from her hands. She would just hold her healing hands over the petri dishes of bacteria. And the ones that she intentionally acted upon were seen to increase their growth rate relative to those samples that weren't treated. So I think this is a level of experiment that's within our abilities to get involved in. Another example of subtle or paranormal trends, changes induced in biological form, comes from Ian Stevenson's work recorded in his book, Reincarnation in Biology. What he showed is that people who claim to have previously existed as another person who can be identified sometimes show birthmarks in the same places as wounds that resulted in the death of their previous incarnation. This example showed on the right, there's an autopsy drawing of the person who died by gunshot. And you'll notice there's one central hole surrounded by a few others. The person was killed with a shotgun blast. And the person who claims to remember the previous life in that body has on their chest birthmarks in the same place. So again, this is some paranormal influence, perhaps carried by the subtle body from one incarnation to the next. Another source of paranormal modification of biological form comes from miraculous healings at places like Lourdes in France. Lourdes is a very interesting place. There are many cures that have taken place there when people take bath or in other words, or in other ways are exposed to the waters from the spring in this cave where the Virgin Mary appeared some time ago, 19th century. Uh, the the cures are attributed not to any quality of the water itself, but to the higher being that's associated with the place, called the Virgin Mary, because of course this took place in the cultural context of South Europe, which is Catholic. Maybe if it had occurred in some other part of the world, the healing goddess may have been known by some other name. But there's a medical institute there that very carefully documents any reported cures. There was one case that was recorded by Alfred Russel Wallace in his research that was about a French workman who had a very severe case of varicose veins, and after being treated at Lourdes, he uh, the the condition went completely away. And Wallace had noticed some other things as well, how different mediums were, according to him, able to produce forms of biological entities. They were transitory in the sense that they didn't remain very long, but he observed, for example, the medium Monk, a Mr. Monk, who produced from his body the form of a human being. And Wallace and others had witnessed that the form emerged from him and merged back into his body. So in summary, I presented in this chapter a sampling of the kinds of observations that I'm talking about related to the modification and production of biological form. So by noticing and recording these things that we can observe, we might, just as Darwin did, project it on a larger scale. So that's part of the case for the production of biological forms for conscious cells to occupy during their stay on this material level of reality. Now, going beyond that, the universe itself appears to be designed for life to exist in it. This is dealt with in chapter 10 of Human Devolution. It's called A Universe Designed for Life. Called the fine-tuning problem because our universe appears to be finely tuned for life to exist in it. Actually, the equations of quantum mechanics and relativity kind of predict that we should have a very featureless universe. How we get all this complexity that we observe in it is not easy to explain. Actually, things have to be very finely tuned for this situation to exist. There are ratios of natural forces and particles and different entities, physical entities, that are very finely tuned, so that if they were even slightly different than they are, we wouldn't have a universe. We wouldn't have stable atoms. We wouldn't have stars and planets and chemicals that would bond together in such a way as to spontaneously produce life forms according to their understanding. One of these finely tuned ratios is the ratio of the mass of the proton to the mass of the electron. It's at a certain value. And if it were even slightly different, as I said, we wouldn't have stable atoms and therefore no chemistry, what to speak of biochemistry. There was an astronomer, actually the royal astronomer in England at the time, Sir Martin Rees, who wrote a book, Just Six Numbers. He pointed out that if you take these six numbers, which I explain more in detail in Human Devolution in this chapter, the binding energy of the atomic nuclei, the average density of matter in the universe, the energy content of empty space, density variations in the energy of the early universe, our exact number of dimensions. If any of these values were just even slightly different from the what they actually are, I mean, he said in his book, Just Six Numbers, they constitute a recipe for the universe. And if any one of them were to be untuned, there would be no stars, no life. So this is an ongoing, unresolved issue in astrophysics. There are people who take all different types of positions on this question, but I think it's something that remains valuable for us to look into and research further. The way that some scientists have tried to deal with this fine-tuning question is to say, well, maybe there are millions and billions of universes being produced, coming into existence. Of course, then we have to ask, what is this thing or condition that is producing so many universes? But their idea is that in each universe, the values are set randomly for these different constants and ratios of natural forces. And they say that over time, vast periods of time, and the production of unlimited numbers of universes, eventually you're going to win the lottery. You're going to get the right combination of these numbers. And they're not just 6 of them, actually, there are dozens and dozens of them. And we just happen to be in the one where things are just right. So in that way, they avoid the inference that perhaps the universes were designed by God. Of course, it's very difficult to test this idea that these many universes exist and that the values vary and that there are other universes that might possibly have life in them. But it's basically something that really can't be demonstrated at this time, but it's a popular idea because of it solves a difficult problem. It avoids the idea of having to attribute this fine tuning to some cosmic or divine intelligence. But the Puranas tell us that there are many universes, and they're all finely tuned for life to exist in them. Life exists in all of them. And they were deliberately manifested. So I think last time, so that kind of concludes the review of chapters 9 and 10. Now, at one of our previous sessions, I was asked, I think by Brahmakirti Prabhu, about negative reactions or questions that have been raised when I make these presentations. And I had been concentrating on positive things that different reviewers have said, but there have been negative reviews of the book as well. For example, Michael Roos, a philosopher and historian of science at Florida State University, wrote in Quarterly Review of Biology a very short, sarcastic, dismissive review. He wrote, "There's a strange law of publishing. The crazier and sillier an idea is, the more space it seems to be allowed. Certainly, the law holds for the current book under review, namely Human Devolution, which is about 500 pages." So I've quoted some nice things that C. Mackenzie Brown has said about human devolution in the course of the talks I've given on the different chapters where he's had something relevant to say. But he also says this in this work. So I have great respect for Cremo's painstaking research, historical analyses, and scholarly energy. He undeniably provides intriguing insights into various problems in the history, sociology, and philosophy of science. At the same time, with regard to his use of data, often selective, out of context, and incomplete, I find his Vedic knowledge filter actively at work. So I confess myself to be guilty of that charge. I am selective in my use of data to make a certain point. I think to some extent, every researcher has to be somewhat selective according to what their research goal is. Out of context and incomplete, perhaps. I don't necessarily think so, but I do confess that I do use insights from Vedic sources in my analysis of data. Now, another review from, again, it's a very constructive review by the Italian geneticist. He's an expert in genetic science. He died in 2018, but Sermonti Giuseppe, who wrote a review of human devolution in Rivista di Biologia. It was written in Italian, but in his English summary, he wrote, see, I've got to move something. Well, anyways, this controversial book tries to reinterpret the origin of species, chiefly that of man, in accordance with the truths of the Vedic tradition by adopting categories of the paranormal. A devolution of pure spirits to minds and eventually to bodies is assumed. A copious and reliable documentation of paranormal phenomena is presented. The reviewer, namely Sermonti, makes an attempt to reinterpret some of the reported facts, as well as the whole picture, with concepts and terms somewhat more palatable to normal science. So what he's saying there, I mean, he's basically sympathetic to the point of view I was expressing, but he's wishing I could have put it in terms more palatable to normal science, in his opinion. So that may be a task that also confronts current researchers working in Bhaktivedanta Institute, how to come up with terminology and expression of concepts that is palatable to normal science, if that's possible. Some of the things he said were very interesting in terms of the kinds of questions that people raise, intelligent people raise, when they encounter a presentation like this. Sermonti wrote in his review, I had someone translate it for me from the Italian. You know, there was only that in English in the original paper was only that paragraph, short paragraph English summary, but this is a translation of his Italian. The question here is whether scientific truth and revealed truth, in other words, Shastric truth, can and should be subjected to the same validation criteria. My personal opinion is that the sacred texts contain an immense legacy of truth and that they have promoted and conformed science. Nevertheless, I do not think that they deserve the same treatment as scientific data. On the contrary, as Oscar Wilde wrote, religions die when they are proven to be true. Cremo does not concur with this idea, but sets reality on different planes and refuses to confine science to the material level. So he's saying, as I understand it, that I'm not perhaps respecting the difference between scientific evidence and the evidence from revealed sources like the Vedas. Now, in terms, which is not exactly true, I have always written that I can't use Vedic statements as evidence in a scientific discussion. But what I can do is look at the evidence, make an evaluation of it, and if it turns out that it's consistent with the Vedic truths, then point that out. Uh, Now, here in this quote from his review, he says, notwithstanding the level of sympathy that one might have for psychic and parapsychic phenomena, I associate myself with Cremo's view that dismissing them summarily can hardly be classified as a scientific approach, as is ranging them alongside frauds, hallucinations, and deliberate falsehoods, and treating as fools, simpletons, and scoundrels witnesses who have honored science, politics, and the arts, and have contributed to the founding of the present world. In other words, he's agreeing with me that this paranormal evidence can't be dismissed, a priori. So that's good. So he says, I present these things, these paranormal accounts, he says, in a credible and sometimes indisputable way. However, he, in other words, me, does not present a shareable interpretation, and he relates them using the customary jargon of the paranormal: telepathy, reincarnation, levitation, post-mortem experiences, apparitions, possessions, bilocations, precognitions, communications with the otherworldly, miraculous cures. Every one of these terms contains a metaphysical, religious, or popular presupposition, which makes the concept unacceptable to normal science. So this is a kind of criticism that the terminology that's used in the book contains within it presuppositions, he says, which make them unacceptable to normal science. In other words, if you're talking about the paranormal, you're supposing that there is. Uh, I think it's something that we still struggle with even today, is like, how do you define consciousness, for example, so that it properly reflects what's there in the Vedic source material, what's palatable to modern scientists who we're interacting with, and our devotional community. What terminology do we employ for these sorts of things? So I think that's an ongoing effort. Uh, and this is an example of someone noticing that. And again, he more or less makes the same point here, um, but adds another interesting aspect. He says, he was trying to help in this article. He was favorable to what I was trying to do, but he says, I'm not presenting the paranormal within a lexis. That means vocabulary acceptable to normal science. He says, you've used terminology that comes from paranormal studies and spiritual knowledge. He accuses me, he says, he does not endeavor to seek analogies between scientific physics and the themes of Oriental thought, as Fritjof Capra does in the Tao of Physics. He throws his Oriental keys on the table and lets us work it out for ourselves, something which I am trying to do. So I thought that was interesting. finally, he talks about my overall vision. And he says this vision permitted Cremo his unprecedented reconnaissance of forbidden paleontology, from which have emerged evidence and human artifacts so old and unexpected that they arouse suspicion about the veracity of the version that official paleontologists promote, or induce us to burn Cremo's books. So I thought that was interesting. I like that. It says if you look at the work, I think he was referring to forbidden archaeology, but he put it in the context, the larger context of paleontology. He said that work was done so well that you've got two choices. Either you become suspicious of the current account, or you burn Cremo's books. So I'm going to end with another example. That was what I've just considered is impact on the scientific discourse at the time the book was published and being represented, which is, basically the very early 21st century. The book was published in a number of languages. One of them was Russian. This is the Russian edition of Human Devolution. And I did several lecture tours in Russia. This was at one of the main universities in Moscow, either Russian, the Moscow Government University, MGU, or the People's Friendship University. This was a graduate seminar by a professor there. I believe it was History and Philosophy of Science. And I gave a presentation, a short presentation on human devolution. And then we had a discussion. This was the professor, Dr. Maslov, and his students. And it's really an opportunity to discuss these topics with very intelligent people, the kind I think we would like to influence. When I was in Moscow, I also did several major media interviews on the biggest national Russian television networks. This was one of them. And this is another. And I also spoke on major national radio networks. This is Говорит Moscow, Talk Moscow. And this was Radio Mayak. It's had 20 million listeners. After I did these media events in Moscow, my publisher told me that Vladimir Putin's office had ordered 6 copies of the Russian edition of Human Devolution. So here's another reporter trying to wrap her mind around some of the concepts. On the left, there's my translator. This was an interesting event that took place at the Russian Academy of Science building regional center at Tyumen in southern Siberia. It's like a big oil town. And some professors had invited me to speak about human devolution at the Human Government University, the big university there. But some professors objected and the lecture was canceled. So the director of the Russian Academy of Science regional branch said, well, if they won't let him speak at the university, he could speak here. So this is the academics, scientists, and students who showed up for the talk at the Russian Academy of Sciences. And the professors who invited me said more people came than would have come if the lecture had been held at the university. It was kind of like standing room only. You know, the all the chairs around the meeting table were occupied, and then people were sitting on the floors and standing up. And then afterwards, I had a private meeting with the regional director of the Russian Academy of Sciences. He's standing there, and the two ladies are anthropology professors, and I think there's another professor there, and then my translator. Uh, and we had a, a very good conversation. One of the anthropologists was telling me she used the Russian edition of Forbidden Archaeology as a text in her anthropology class. Later, I spoke at the university itself. I guess they decided better to just let me speak. So I spoke at the biology department of that university where they had originally canceled one of my lectures. After we held the first one at the Russian Academy of Science, they decided, all right, just let them talk. This was in Ekaterinburg. You know, there was a reporter that stayed with me all day. We spoke at the Natural History Museum. Of course, this is Siberia, so it's not like tropical area or anything. And as usual, there was an evening lecture. These are young people standing in line to get their copies of Human Devolution signed. And at this institution in Rybinsk in Russia, a lecture had been arranged on human devolution. And my translator called me up and told me, you have to be careful tomorrow because they told me that at this institution, there's a group, they call themselves the evil philosophers, and they say they're going to rip you apart. So the evil philosophers are in the second row there, starting here. But I gave my talk, they listened to it, and it seemed to be different from anything that they expected. And they wound up not attacking me, but asking for a picture. So that's me with the evil philosophers. This is another philosophy professor with his graduate students in philosophy, including philosophy of science. And I mean, this happened all over Russia. I'm just showing a few pictures here. So one of the students buying a copy of Human Devolution. There's a professor putting my card in his pocket. And but in addition to these smaller, you could say in one sense, events where I'm talking only to a few people, but influential and intelligent people. In addition to events like that, there were uh, bigger public presentations, this being in Vladivostok, which is in the far eastern part of Siberia on the Sea of Japan. And I wasn't just speaking to philosophy audiences. I spoke at many science oriented universities and groups. This is the science department of the Omsk Government University. Uh, there was a nice group of scientists and science students there to hear a talk on human devolution. When I was giving a talk, I noticed this man. He was there. He was kind of glaring at me the whole time, and he looked like he wanted to jump out of his seat and protest or something. But it turned out he was just very seriously listening to what I had to say, and he turned out to be quite friendly. There he is getting his book signed that he just bought. Um, I also spoke at the Russian National Library in St. Petersburg, uh, talked about human devolution there. It was, again, one of these places that was completely packed. People were sitting on the floors, standing in the doorways. Uh, as usual, very intelligent questions. And a lot of people, of course, got books. Some of the more interested people were invited to a private meeting. Uh, this event took place in Vladimir in Russia. Standing to the right of me is Abhinandana, who's a professor there. He's a devotee. And after this conference at which I spoke, I had a meeting with the uh, Russian devotee scientists and academics who were there. And as usual, Abhinandana had arranged some media interviews, and some of them wanted to follow up on my spiritual practices. So came to the temple and interviewed me about Krishna consciousness. So that brings me to the end of today's review of chapters 9 and 10, its impact and current relevance. Uh, I would say that it's always helpful for us to be producing literature because literature provides a platform for us to become really public intellectuals. It offers an opportunity to interact with media, with different educational and scientific institutions, and give people ideas that will make them think about these fundamental questions of who are we, where are we, and where we should be going. So next time, in 2 weeks from now, going to wrap up this series for the book club discussions on human devolution with chapter 11, Human Devolution, a Vedic account. So thank you. Uh, yeah, these are some of my books. And we do have an offer on them. You can read them or burn them as you please.
Judah Carnbo, that's such an enjoyable lecture. I love that. I've seen before, but I love your Russian tour, how they so seriously took to it. I'm curious what Putin thought, but we won't find that out. When you're done with this book, are you considering doing another book with us?
I've contributed to books, and I think I've got a chapter coming up in one of your books.
Oh, no. What I meant, I didn't word that as I meant. What I meant is, would you consider at our book club presenting another one of your books?
Oh, sure, I'd be happy to do that.
Maybe Leela can be in touch with you on it, because when you're done, I'd like to continue. What book would you consider doing next?
Well, one would be My Science, My Religion, which
That's the one
is,
I was thinking of. Yeah.
yeah, that would be worth looking at, I think.
I know so. I think it's particularly important for this particular audience. It says a lot. Yeah, so let's consider, if you don't mind, continuing. Though we may not have so many online, our social media is going through a major upgrade now, and I fully expect that there's going to get wide distribution of these talks.
Yeah, well, uh, I'm grateful for the opportunity to take a retrospective look at things that I've done. And I'd be happy to continue with some of the other works as well. And as far as the audience goes, that's not a consideration on my part. It's valuable for me even to go through this and try to look at it in terms of what impact it had at the time and what its current relevance may be.
Yeah. And I think there's, and of course we're planning our next BI workshop on evolution, and we're probably moving it to the fall from the spring. So I'll keep you informed, because Condity pushed that we really want to, the results of that may be important for the museum. So we're moving that up. So I'll keep you informed.
Okay, great.
Thanks. Okay, over.
Thank you very much, Truta Karma Prabhu. Let's open it up for any comments or questions. Anyone can unmute themselves or write something in the chat. I really appreciated the 10th chapter, the fine tuning. A few months ago, Scientific American magazine had an article. It's a nice article about the multiverse, and first starting off by describing what is meant by that word, because it's been used. The concept has shifted, but it's been used for maybe at least hundreds of years. Early philosophers mentioned it, but it was in a different context, and so they're explaining what is really meant by the multiverse, and giving the quantum physics explanation of the word and how they're using it, and also the cosmology explanation of the multiverse, which is closer to what you were saying about the different universes, what they call the bubbles. So that was interesting. And I was just wondering, one of the issues with it is just that it's not observable as of right now. And so I was thinking, just like all of these advancements in technology have brought up different things. When we started, we were talking about the shifting of the ideas that we have about humans on this planet, as shown by science. I was thinking there will be a day when technology can actually show these multiverses, if in fact they are out there. I just found that interesting. It's never the end of the search to understand.
The unobservables play a big role in ordinary science as it's practiced today. Certain things are noticed only by their effects. Dark matter, dark energy, they're posited because they help explain phenomena that can be observed. So even in modern science and astrophysics and quantum mechanics, they invoke unobservables to explain what can be observed. And even Darwin, as I was pointing out today, used something unobservable. In other words, one species changing into another. That's not been observed. But he adduced evidence that such a thing might possibly be happening. Of course, now everyone's pretty much convinced that it does happen, that one species does transform into another. But again, that's an unobserved phenomenon. It's something that's inferred from various lines of evidence.
Yeah, that brings up a really interesting point about what a theory is, because we were having a discussion with one of the cosmologists here, and he was explaining, like you said, people are convinced that it is happening as it's being described, but no one's observed it. And what is really what is a theory, and how much of it has been actually observed or proven in a specific way, so that even that sometimes we forget that a theory is a theory, something that's being proposed, like you said, by its effects. That'd be an interesting thing to talk about, just a theory in its most essential sense.
Yeah. Well, one thing that's important is you were mentioning the different understandings of the word multiverse. So really to discuss these things, one's going to discuss with another person or group of people. There should be some common understanding of what the terms used mean. And as far as theories are concerned, the kind of the gold standard in modern science is a theory that allows one to predict something that will happen, with mathematical precision. That's kind of like the gold standard. And then other so-called theories may be inferences to the best explanation, as they sometimes call it. They're the Darwinian theory of evolution, as he formulated it, wasn't a predictive type of theory. Although later, with the introduction of genetics, it's become, there are more mathematically predictable aspects to it. But really it's an inference based on things that we observe, and we posit, well, what's the best explanation? Well, that there must be some continuous modification of biological form that goes from one species to another. And maybe this is a topic for the conference in the fall, but I'm proposing Darwin's insight was actually correct in the sense that there is something that's continuously modifying, but it's not the gross physical body, it's the subtle material body composed of mind, intelligence, and false ego, among other subtle material elements, that modifies constantly and according to its state at the time of death of an organism, the conscious self within that form gets another form, gets placed in another form based on the state of the subtle body at the time of leaving the previous body. So there appears to be some evidence for that.
Fascinating. Yeah, I really appreciate that. So now I guess the question is, how does that transfer of information happen? And
Yeah, well, I think this is going to require contributions from our mathematicians, our philosophers, our scientists working in different fields, whether it's astrophysics or cognitive science or molecular biology or whatever. It's an ongoing effort to ultimately understand our real nature and what our place in the cosmos is, whether we're accidental creatures existing in an accidental universe and ultimately everything will be finished, or if there's some other destiny that awaits us.
yeah, I like that point, almost like giving, like you mentioned, all of these subjects that people can engage in that understanding, so that they're not an end to themselves, but they're adding something to a real understanding of who we are.
Yeah, I think there was something from Sermonti that I did read, which relates to this issue. See if I can- Yeah, okay. Something is covering part of the quote on my page, but can you see that quote?
Yes, I can see it clearly. Would you like me to read it?
Yes.
Okay. Cremo seems to propose a revolutionary alternative. Science, he seems to say, gets us nowhere. It does not give an answer to the fundamental whys. It lets us drift desperately in the dark. Let us therefore move to other dimensions to search for a light and a sense. If this can help us interpret some verifiable reality, all the better. But the important thing is to realize that we are the conclusion of a process that started up there.
That's
This
the part.
vision, yeah, yeah, very nice.
That's
He
that's the
got
part
it.
I wanted to, yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
because ultimately, I'm not interested in stones and bones. I'm interested ultimately in what's going to happen to me, the conscious individual personal self that I am. Is that just some temporary byproduct of bioelectrical activity in the brain that will be finished, that will be extinguished when at the time of death, the chemicals in the brain, the neurons, and everything that's going on up there ceases? Do I cease? Ultimately, that's the question that I'm interested in. And it's why I'm attracted to the Vedic cosmology and Vedic philosophy of life, is that, and it's not just some vague hope, but it's a system of knowledge and practice that gives some not just idea, but some actually verifiable on some deep sense evidence that no, I'm not just a temporary flash in the universe that will be gone forever in a limited period of time.
Yeah, it's a little bit depressing that to think we're just a collection of molecules that will never be again. And I like the emphasis on it being an interdisciplinary thing that can shed some light on it, not just one discipline or another. And then, sometimes the scientists and the philosophers can't get along, but this is saying, no, we need everyone to contribute to this understanding. We have a question by Ashish. How many dimensions really exist in the universe? We experience only 4 dimensions, 3 for space and 1 for time.
Yes, of course there are researchers, scientists who, particularly those that are proposing some variety of string theory, who say there are actually more dimensions. And that's in the mathematical sense. The term dimension can be used in a popular sense, which tends to mean some different level of reality, some different level of conscious experience. So that's one meaning. But usually in scientific terms, when they're speaking about dimensions, they're speaking about mathematical dimensions. And that can have, depending upon how one analyzes this mathematically, one could propose that these extra dimensions, which aren't visible to us in our normal waking experience, do have some consequences or features that do reveal themselves. But mostly it's in the mathematical sense they talk about dimensions, which is why when I'm speaking of a multi-level cosmos or a cosmic hierarchy of beings, I tend to shy away from using the word dimension to describe it, because unless one clarifies exactly what one means by using the term dimension, you wind up not being able to communicate very well about it.
Yeah, so many words now are being used for so many different purposes that, yeah, you're right. One needs to clarify, like what you said, consciousness, defining that. Mm. Okay, any other questions or comments? Okay, so we will end here. Thank you all very much. And I'm looking forward to our last session. This is it's been an interesting journey. Thank you very much. I was just, when you were sharing about, you've been sharing about all the different places that this took you. I was thinking this book, it wasn't only the collection of your work, but it also took you on an adventure to all of these places to meet all these people. It's very exciting. People threatening to, I mean, not in a good way, but people threatening. You never know what someone's reaction is going to be to the information that you're presenting. Did you ever imagine that you were going to have that kind of a journey with this book?
I really, at the time I wrote the book, Human Devolution, it was during the late 1980s and early, well, Human Devolution was written in the early 1990s, excuse me. I was thinking about forbidden archaeology. But I kind of started this journey before the wall came down and the communist governments in Eastern Europe and Russia were replaced. So no, I didn't imagine when I started this journey that I would be going to Russia, for example. But to me, and it's not that it's just me, when I say I went to all these places in Russia, that was because somebody in our devotee community arranged, for my book to be published, arranged the transportation between all these places, arranged places to stay, uh, arranged interviews, arranged lectures, made sure I was there for them. So it's actually a whole team effort. And production of the book is the same way. It's not that I did the typesetting and all the proofreading and research, all on my own. It required the cooperation of a great many devotees. And ultimately, it wasn't that I'm saying I had some idea to do something and so many people assisted and helped. I think we're all of us trying to satisfy the desire of Srila Prabhupada, who had the idea to establish a Bhaktivedanta Institute, who provided the impetus to become public intellectuals and discuss these questions with intelligent people, the intelligent class of people. I mean, he says in his introduction to, his preface actually to his monumental work, his translation and commentary on the Srimad Bhagavatam, that he intends this work for the intelligent class of person. So it's not that I consider myself to be the center of this. I just happy that there were many disciples and grand disciples of Srila Prabhupada who believed in what he was trying to do in establishing the Bhaktivedanta Institute, and we've all played our roles in that.
Hmm.
So I just hope to continue to remain of service.
Yeah. Thank you very much. That's thank you for that reminder. Yeah, it takes a village and we can do a lot more together than as individuals. Very much appreciated. Okay, thank you everyone. Have a wonderful weekend. Thank you, Drita Karma Prabhu, for spending your Saturday morning with us. And we will see you in 2 weeks for our last session of Human De-Evolution. And then we'll see what comes next.
Okay.
Okay.